With that, it's 7:02, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I want to first introduce Alexandra Peters, who wanted to say a few words before we turn things over to our presenter.
Hi, so I'm Alexandra. I'm a sampler collector. You can see behind me all over my walls. And the Textile Conservation Workshop, where Meredith Wilcox Levine is a conservator, I discovered about 30 years ago when I sort of timidly brought them a sampler, and I really didn't know much about this sampler, but they were so lovely and kind to me. And it's a wonderful place because it's in an old general store, and there are, I think, there's 6 of you, 8 of you, Meredith?
There are 4 full-time conservators at this point.
Yeah. And so I always try and peek around and look and see what I can see what they're working on, which is amazing always. And I don't know, I meant to go back and look and see, but I think I've had like 30, 35, 40 samplers conserved at Textile Conservation Workshop, and I know I have 10 there right now. What the work they do is extraordinary. They're a not-for-profit, and I encourage you to bring whatever, as when I sent out a notice about it to my friends, all these people responded saying, "Oh, I took my grandmother's thing. I had us for whatever." And so a lot of people have brought things in. And actually, I also have, I had also taken a Fortuny dress that my daughter had inherited, and we didn't know how to deal with it. So all sorts of things are done at the Textile Conservation Workshop. But this is the place where museums, really important places, and historical societies of note, like Litchfield Historical Society, bring their textiles. So I'm so delighted and pleased to welcome Meredith tonight. Thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And Alex, I think, would you like to do the formal?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So thank you, Alexandra. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce formally our speaker for tonight's program. We are thrilled to have her here. I'm thrilled to do another program in this series about samplers and textiles. So Meredith Wilcox Levine is a textile conservator at the Textile Conservation Workshop in South Salem, New York. She holds a Master of Science degree in Historic Costume and Textiles from the University of Rhode Island's Department of Textiles, Fashion Merchandising and Design, with a focus in textile conservation. During her training, she completed internships at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. Before entering the conservation field, Meredith received a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree in theatrical costume design and production from Syracuse University. She is a professional member of the American Institute for Conservation of Historic and Artistic Works and the Costume Society of America. So everyone join me in giving a big welcome to Meredith. And Meredith, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex and Alexandra, and it is a pleasure to be here with all of you. I'm so happy to be talking about samplers and needleworks and the role that conservation and conservators play in preserving these wonderful works of art. I'm going to turn off my screen so you don't have to watch me read my notes, but take a look at all of these lovely slides that I have for you. Let me see. All right. Let's start with, today we will cover a basic overview of samplers and silk needleworks, as well as the materials used and the condition issues that are common in both of these types of textiles. I will then give you an overview of the field of textile conservation and the steps a conservator would take in treating a textile. I will also present specific treatments conducted on a series of needleworks that those of you familiar with the Litchfield Historical Society collection and the recent exhibits that they have and the samplers of Miss Alexandra Peters may recognize. But first, let's start with a very basic overview of these important textiles. I'll leave the nuances to the historians, but first, samplers were created by young girls in the 18th and 19th centuries as practice pieces for a variety of basic stitches that would be used later to produce clothing or other household textiles. Silk needleworks combined meticulous needlework using fine silk threads and watercolor painting on silk fabric. The designs were often based on published engravings, some of which were produced specifically for reproduction with a needle. And on the right-hand side, you will see the painted faces of these figures and the delicately embroidered garments. Samplers in the United States were usually made with silk and wool threads on a cotton ground cloth. The linen and wool ground cloths were more prevalent in Europe and could be imported. Dyes of the time were natural, as synthetic dyes were not invented until 1856. As I mentioned before, silk needleworks combined silk yarns of various textures on a silk ground, which could be painted or left plain. These works were completed under some sort of tension, either within a working embroidery hoop or on a strainer. There are several key issues that arise with historic samplers and needleworks. Degradation of the various fiber types, the use of acidic mounting materials that cause deterioration of the fibers, damaging attachment methods during mounting, pests, and unsavory environmental factors all can cause significant damage to an artifact. The different fiber types within these needleworks degrade in different ways and at different speeds. Silk, while robust and strong and brightly colored when newly dyed, degrades much more readily than other fibers when exposed to light and moisture. Wool fibers are also sensitive to light fading and attract insects. Cellulosic fibers, like cotton and linen, are prone to discoloration and acidification. Textiles with fiber combinations, such as these, can present a multitude of issues at a time. Weakened fibers can lead to structural damage and other problems, such as you see here. This sampler is extremely acidified and has torn pretty extensively. This one was mounted on a board, and you can see all of the tears down the middle. Silk is one of the most problematic. Silk is highly photosensitive, similar to paper, and degrades readily when exposed to sunlight. Silk fibers absorb radiation and undergo a photochemical reaction once the photon energy threshold is exceeded. White fabrics will dry out, crack, and deform, and even turn yellow with prolonged exposure, as you can see in this silk flag. The same reaction causes dyed silks to fade. Here you can see that the colors on the back of the sampler, seen on the right, are more vibrant than those on the front, on the left, which were exposed to light. The yellow and pink yarns have faded significantly. The many dyes in samplers are not only susceptible to light, but also to moisture. Dye bleed is a common problem, as seen in this sampler. Here, the blue and green yarns were dyed with sulfonated indigo, which bleeds readily when exposed to water. Moisture can also be harmful to samplers when a dye has an iron component. Metals were often used in natural mordants used during dyeing, and as the iron ages, it oxidizes and produces corrosive iron II ions. Exposure to humidity and moisture can cause seepage of these ions into adjacent fibers, which will cause and expand damage over time. Pests that attack protein fiber textiles, such as wool and silk, can be an issue for samplers and other needleworks. Clothes and webbing moth larvae eat protein in preparation for metamorphosis. Adult moths will lay their eggs on or in immediate proximity to such a food source, creating the next generation of eaters. Insects are opportunistic and will make a home and feeding ground wherever they find a stable food source. Beetles and moths will make holes in fabrics, and the latter will also cause damage called grazing, where the top layer or pile of a fabric will be eaten away without creating a hole. The adult beetles and the larvae of both moth species will leave droppings called frass, which you see in the middle. And moths spin their cocoons on a textile, hence the webbing, which you can see on the right in those tweezers. Framed textiles can serve as a safe haven for insects, as an infestation may not be immediately visible, allowing many generations to prosper and destroy in the process. We find a lot of insect activity on the backs of samplers, where they eat the back of embroidery yarns. And so they are never really seen from the front until we open up a piece. Mold growth can also be an issue in framed textiles that have been exposed to moisture. Even with a backing paper on a framed piece, it can be easy to miss without a thorough examination and have detrimental results. In this case, the mold permeated through all the layers of mounting material and is visible on the front of the sampler. As textiles deteriorate over time, the acidic products of the degradation process accumulate in the fibers and serve to accelerate the aging of the textile. These degradation products are often tan or yellow in color, which contributes to the aged appearance of many antique textiles. This is the most visible in the ground fabric of samplers, though the acidic byproducts may be present in all of the fibers. Here you can see just how dark the ground of this sampler is. Acidification can be exacerbated by the framing conditions. Many times, samplers arrive at our shop mounted on old wooden shingles, and this is noted to contribute greatly to the overall brown and brittle characteristic of the ground fabrics, as wood contains acids which migrate and damage the fibers. On the left, the canvas of the piece has been in contact with both the wooden shingle on which it is mounted and the wooden frame, causing severe discoloration. On the right, a shingle behind a mounting board has left a severe wood burn in the material. Thank goodness it wasn't in contact with the actual textile. Wooden shingles are not the only type of acidic mounting surface one may see. On the left, a textile was mounted, laced around an acidic board. And on the right, the sampler was adhered to an acidic board with a plant-based glue around the perimeter. I've also seen textiles attached with many, many different types of tape, which is honestly quite horrifying. Most framed needleworks that I have examined have been attached to a wooden structure with metal brads or nails, many of which have oxidized and damaged the surrounding fabric. They are often very difficult to remove without damaging the piece. Many historic mounting methods cause damage to the structure of the textile and are often irreversible. Now let's talk about what the role of the conservator is in caring for these types of textiles. The conservator is an expert who respects the original work and intention of the maker, and who is not seeking to make a piece conform to contemporary taste. Instead, The priority is to prolong the life of the textile as close as possible to its original state to do what is best for the object itself. A good conservator has a sense of his or her significant role in balancing the past and future of a piece, and with this in mind, tries always to favor treatments that are protective, but also reversible. In general, in a conservation lab, the focus will be on structural assistance to a piece, with minimal interest in making an object appear new again. Note that this is in striking contrast to traditional restoration, an approach in which historical integrity is often sacrificed to achieve a more satisfying visual aesthetic. In conservation, wear and tear can be accepted as part of the natural life of the piece. Nevertheless, in conservation, stains still do get cleaned. Holes still do get patched, like the damage on this jersey. And new aesthetically minded support structures are added, such as these fabric support straps on the back of this tapestry. There are, in fact, many constructive ways in which a conservator can both enhance the appearance of a textile and inhibit further deterioration. The Textile Conservation Workshop is a nonprofit laboratory that provides conservation services for textiles of all kinds, family heirlooms, rare and fragile textiles, and everything in between. Our many clients, which include museums, historical societies, antiquarians, collectors, and dealers, as well as private clients, often present their textiles with a diversity of intentions. Sometimes we are asked to adapt the strict museum ethic to meet more personal needs. But adaptation in our workshop does not mean sacrificing the integrity of a textile. And as conservators, our code of ethics bars us from unrestrained alteration. Nonetheless, sometimes textiles do require a thoughtful, well-documented restoration approach, and it is imperative that conservators possess no less than a restorer's fine understanding of the craft at hand. Pieces often arrive at our lab already saturated with years upon years of previous repair work. Here you can see a sampler with a previous repair patch. Indeed, on occasion, when the balance of the work is tipped toward restoration, our workshop still upholds the museum ethic by preserving every aspect of the original, using materials tested and proven to possess superior aging quality, favoring reversible treatments, and documenting all the steps and materials used in the process. Before we dive into any treatment, a thorough documentation of the present condition of the textile is essential to determine what problems exist and how they might be best approached. Without meticulously examining how a piece is constructed, the materials that were used, and how it might be expected to respond to treatments, it is impossible to begin even the most simple treatment in a safe and responsible way. Our examination includes a technical description of the piece, including microscopic identification of the fibers in each element, written documentation of the artifact's present condition, which includes photography, and step-by-step recommendations for the treatment and what the expected result of that treatment may be. Frequently, we make drawings of textiles to map out specific areas of damage. After all preliminary documentation is complete, and the client has agreed upon a proposed treatment course, treatment may begin. This may include dry surface cleaning and wet cleaning, sewing, mounting, and sometimes removing alterations and previous repairs which stress or compromise the original piece in some way. Here you can see a large repaired tear in this embroidered piano shawl, where the damage is now spreading beyond the line of repair stitches. When the risks of active treatment run too high, the conservator will advocate thorough documentation and then simply suggest preventive and protective measures that, without invasive treatment, do much to ensure a long future for even the most fragile piece. Cleaning is the most universally requested treatment for all costumes, for all textiles, flat or costume. Excuse me. The one kind of cleaning which most textiles can withstand, when done carefully, is vacuuming. Vacuuming removes any airborne particulate matter that is embedded in the textile fibers. We usually work with a vacuum on low suction and a small, smooth-edged handheld vacuuming attachment or micro attachment, as seen here. Frequently, vacuuming is carried out through a protective screen, which prevents fragments or loose areas from tearing or being sucked up into the vacuum. Additional surface cleaning methods can be very effective, as seen on this Matisse silk screen. Airborne particulate soiling, especially anything sooty, can be resistant to vacuuming. In this case, small latex sponges allowed much of the surface soiling to be removed. You can see the difference between the clean and untreated areas along the line on the left. And on the right, you can see what came off on those sponges. It was pretty gross. As part of our initial condition report, we test all of the stains and dyes in a piece to see what solvents are most effective on the soiling, but will not alter or move the fabric dyes during treatment. As you can see on the right, the cotton stars on this flag are prime candidates for aqueous treatment, as they are inundated with the acidic byproducts I mentioned earlier. For a small number of pieces, wet cleaning a fabric, and here is a quilt in our wash table, it is the single most helpful process in its preservation. It removes the dirt, grease, pollutants, insect larvae, and mildew, and helps to neutralize the notorious acidic products of aging, which are known to turn a textile yellow. Here you can see the yellow discoloration releasing from a woven coverlet into the water. However, wet cleaning can also be the single most destructive process if not done with care. It is also the treatment we conduct that is completely irreversible. Many fabrics have come into our workshop for repair of damage that was the result of careless wet cleaning. Holes ripped into them by washing machines, bleach damage, discoloration from bleeding dyes, fabric or sewing thread loss, and puckering. This quilt is a prime example of a piece that was cleaned improperly, causing bleeding of the red fabric into the surrounding areas. Even when done carefully, cleaning with water puts strain on the fibers as they swell with absorption, move with the water, and shrink again as they dry. Embroideries such as samplers are almost never wet cleaned, as they are particularly susceptible to damage, and often include bleeding dyes, as I mentioned earlier. In fact, many samplers that come to the workshop have already experienced dye bleed, often due to exposure to moisture. Cleaning of such embroideries requires a more methodical, localized approach. Sometimes spot cleaning is extremely successful in reducing discoloration, though sometimes we encounter stains that are simply too persistent even for our methods. Sewing repairs and stabilization come after cleaning. In this case, repairs on a quilt involve a simple approach for consolidation: a sheer net as an almost invisible covering. This is a simple alternative to replacing old, worn squares with new fabrics, an approach that would destroy the historical authenticity of a quilt. On the left, you can see a net overlay in process, complete with a curved surgical needle we use to sew the fabric in place. On the right is a finished net patch, where the edges have already been trimmed. Note that the net is almost invisible and so does not drastically alter the look of the piece, allowing the original fabric to be both visible and secure. We favor cotton thread, and all the stitching is done by hand. Other consolidation and stabilization approaches include traditional tear repair with fine sewing techniques, patching and couching, such as on this paisley shawl, and occasionally, when the fabric is too fragile to sustain stitching, conservation grade adhesives. Here, the inked signature on the border of a sampler was tearing, partially due to the original mounting tacks. With the addition of a small adhesive patch on the reverse, the area is repaired and the text is legible again. Traditional, commercially available adhesives are never suggested, are never used in conservation or mounting treatments. Never use stitch witchery. Never, never, never. So far, I've covered the challenges presented by historic needleworks, the role and ethics of the conservator, and the basic kinds of treatments a textile conservator might provide. Now you can see some of the treatments I've mentioned in context. Each of these examples is a sampler or needlework belonging to historian and collector Alexandra Peters or the Litchfield Historical Society. I'll explain each object and treatment as we go. As I mentioned earlier, original mounts for samplers are often far from ideal in terms of preservation. In the case of this sampler, made in 1840 by Rebecca Cohn, a new mount was necessary to replace an acidic cardboard one. Conservation mounting methods focus on preserving the structural stability of the piece while also addressing the concept of reversibility. To prepare a sampler for framing, we create a fabric-covered archival ragboard mount. The board is covered with a thoroughly washed and scoured cotton fabric, stretched on grain and stitched to itself on the back and sides. We choose a fabric color that will find a balance between blending in with the color of the sampler ground and lightening it so that text is easier to read. When sewing the textile to the mount, we utilize a stitch pattern to avoid weak areas and utilize the stronger part of the weave structure. A curved needle is needed to attach the textile to the mount. Once the piece is stitched to the mount, it can be safely framed. Each mount is sized appropriately for the piece, including a narrow border around the perimeter for spacers during framing. With historic textiles, we aim to keep the piece from contact with any framing elements that could cause pressure on the piece or damage the fibers. We also use ultraviolet filting glazing on all of our framed textiles to help prevent dye fading. This double globe map sampler which features a three-dimensional silk embroidery on a fine silk ground, required removal from its deteriorating original mount and extensive repairs to the silk canvas. Our senior conservator was able to repair it using a lightweight silk fabric lining coated in archival adhesive. The piece was then mounted on archival materials and reframed. This pair of samplers was made by two sisters. The two textiles are very similar in design and execution, with slight differences in overall size, embroidery yarn color, date of completion, and other small differences in positioning of verse lines and lettering. The two samplers were framed together at the time of acquisition, and neither sampler was properly supported within the frame during this time. Treatment at the Textile Conservation Workshop required careful humidification and blocking to straighten them. Humidification was completed through a Tyvek moisture barrier, and blocking of each sampler was done to reduce undulations and distortions prior to mounting. Each sampler was then mounted and framed individually. This exquisite 1807 sampler presented several conundrums for treatment. The ground fabric has a linen warp and wool weft, and the dark brown embroidery floss is extremely delicate. The brown color is known to be produced with dyes containing an iron component, usually derived from nut galls, and tested positive for the corrosive iron 2 ions I described earlier. Because of this, the sampler could not be safely humidified as a whole without causing damage. Localized humidification was conducted along the outer edges only, away from the brown embroidery. Several of the edges were fraying, including the bottom corners. These repairs were addressed during the mounting stage of treatment. This sampler was a testament to insufficient mounting methods. You can see on the left that it was sagging from its mount, and it was removed from its original acidic mount for treatment, mounted on archival mounting materials, and then framed after treatment. This lovely piece was hemmed and machine stitched to a mounting fabric, which was then laced onto an acidic board. Removal of the sampler from the board was possible while keeping this mounting fabric was possible while keeping the laced fabric in place, allowing the original mount to be incorporated into the final framing. The sampler itself was fairly stained and was both surface and spot cleaned to reduce soiling and discoloration. A new archival mount was made, a ragboard mount, and the piece attached and framed in a new frame. And the original mounting board with the laced covering was attached to the back of the frame with a mylar window in the Tyvek dust cover, so it was still visible, as you can see on the right. This needlework is a fine example of the Litchfield School, and it belongs to the Litchfield Historical Society. In this case, the priority was mounting the piece on archival materials, as the needlework itself was in fairly good condition. As with many silk needleworks, unless the original mount is causing a serious problem, removing a piece from the mount would likely cause a larger issue. In this case, rather than replacing the original wooden strainer, the conservator created a pillow-like insert to support the textile from the back and keep the needlework from sagging into the strainer opening. We then worked in conjunction with a frame restorer to repair the original Iglamise glass and regild the original frame. These are just a few examples of the types of treatments that may be conducted on a historic needlework. We've gone over a lot of information today, and I hope you have found it useful. Thank you for joining me for this talk, and I'm ready to answer any questions you might have. Thanks very much.
All righty. Thank you so much, Meredith. There was a lot of old friends in that that presentation, and a lot of pieces of Alexandra's that I've seen post conservation, but not pre. So it was really interesting for me to see them. So we'll go ahead and open up the questions and answers in the chat, whatever function the participants want to use. Please feel free to send us any questions you have for Meredith about conservation methods or pieces she's worked on or anything like that. The question I always like to ask is sort of the favorite question. So do you have a piece that has come through the workshop while you've been there that's either your favorite or maybe your most memorable or maybe most difficult job?
Oh, there's a lot of them have been my favorites in different ways. It's hard because I work on such a large variety of things.
Mhm. Or maybe you're just a recent favorite, something that's
a recent favorite. I actually just finished working on a waistcoat that supposedly belonged to George Washington, that we just sent to the Virginia History Museum,
oh, wonderful.
which was
That
pretty neat. That's
seems
gonna
like
be
a very
part,
timely object with
yeah, it's gonna be
2026
part
on the
of their
horizon.
bisesquicentennial, I believe is the
Mhm.
correct word,
Yep.
exhibit
Yep.
coming up.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a couple questions coming in. So one was, can you give an idea of the time it generally takes for you to restore or remount a sampler? Which I guess would depend on how bad of a shape it is when it comes in, but
Yeah, it all depends on how much treatment it needs. If it's in fairly good condition, it could take anywhere between, it also depends on if it needs to be removed from a mount. If it were to come in and it wasn't mounted already, and it didn't really need a whole lot of stain reduction or anything like that, it just needed to be mounted and framed,
Mhm.
it would probably take 2 or 3 days, probably 3 days. If it needed more, um, if it needed more treatment than that, it would go up from there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we have a few questions maybe from possible clients moving forward about costs. So one is when someone asked if you have a sampler that you'd like to bring in, what kind of cost could be expected in general? And again, I imagine that answer is dependent on condition.
Right.
But then a more detailed same question was, how is it costed out, and are there levels of treatment so a client can do the most important protective measures if they can't afford a full conservation?
Yes.
Which is a good.
So the way that the workshop works is, you are welcome to make an appointment with us, and especially if you are local, to come and bring your piece for us to look at. There's no cost to make an appointment and have us take a look at your piece. What we then do is, if you wanted to leave your piece with us, we do our examination and proposed treatment report, and there is a cost involved in that, and we will we will determine the cost when we see your piece, because it's always contingent on the condition of your piece and how large it is. Normally, if it's a sampler, it's usually about a $200 cost for that initial report, which I described here. It's saying we're going to do the fiber analysis, we're going to do the complete description, and then propose what we would do to treat the piece. And then we have an hourly charge of $100 an hour for the actual labor for the treatment. And we lay that out for you in terms of how many hours we think each step is going to take. And then you can decide to do some of those steps, all of those steps, or none of those steps. And then you can decide from there how you want to proceed. And that's always a discussion that we can have with you and help you decide the course of action you would want to take.
And then we have someone who, I guess, wanted some more information about what local humidification is and how you go about doing that for, like you mentioned, the pieces that might have dye migration if you introduce too much humidity.
So humidification is, when I was talking about cleaning being the most complex thing we do, humidification is the second most complex thing we do, because anything having to do with moisture can be terribly damaging if you don't do it correctly. What I was describing with Tyvek is we use that as a moisture barrier so we can get so we can help control the amount of moisture that comes into contact with an object without it actually getting wet. But doing any sort of humidification of an object is something that you cannot do unless you are absolutely 100% sure that nothing bleeds and that there is nothing in that object that is going to cause a problem, like those dyes and having the iron components and everything. So humidification is not something that I would recommend that anybody do without having done any of those tests on your piece first. So I don't really want to give you a how-to on how to do it.
Yeah. So another question. So someone has a needle roll that has one end that's come apart, and their question is if the workshop takes on items that are not samplers.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
We do pretty much everything.
Mm-hmm. And then they ask how to get in touch with you, and very conveniently there's some contact information on the screen.
Right there.
Someone else, which is a really good question, is what is your schooling history and how did you get started in conservation? And then a follow-up is, do you stitch samplers yourself?
Well, I'll take one at a time.
Yeah.
I started out in theater, and I started out specifically in costuming. So costumes are my background. And after graduating from college and working in theater full time, I decided that I liked it, but I was more interested in the history of it, and I really wanted to. I was going more to museums, and I kind of was like, I'm more interested in those. And can I work with those? And I wanted to work on like the real thing rather than making facsimiles of it. So then I started looking around and discovered the field of textile conservation, and then found a program to pursue that. And that's how I ended up in this field. And I was lucky enough to find the workshop. And do I make samplers myself? I do not. I used to do some embroidery long time ago, but now that I sew every day at work, I don't really do so much.
Yeah.
In my
So need a break from it when you get home. Yeah.
I also have a 3-year-old, so I don't really have time.
That will do it. So someone, which is a really good question, is what's the single most important recommendation to protect current stitching projects to prevent future damage? So people who are making the samplers that may be in museums 50 to 100 years from now, how do they best protect that?
wash your materials before you start using them.
Mhm.
Make sure that there's no excess dye in your embroidery yarns before you start using them. Make sure you scour your ground fabric before you use it and there's no starch or anything in there. And store everything in acid-free materials. Don't put things in acidic cardboard boxes.
Yes.
And
Because
keep things out of the light.
Also
Light
good.
is the killer.
Yes, also very important. So then we have a couple other questions coming in. So this is specific to an object. What is the best way to remove a completely glued 1810 sampler on linen ground, worked in silks? So effectively not glued at the edges, but completely glued to a backing. That might be that's quite a technical question.
Send it to us and see if we can help you. That's a tough one. That's
Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
that's adhesive. Adhesive is the worst. It really is. And I wish nobody glued anything, really. You really have to when we get ones like that, it's really we basically have to chip away at the board from the back, and it's a grueling process. It doesn't always work.
well, yikes.
Yeah.
So another technical question is, what do you use to spot clean? So when you're doing spot cleaning, what's the solution, or what are you using to do that?
It all depends on what the stain is. We actually have a lot the science behind spot removal has advanced a lot, and we do a lot of testing the pH of the stains to help determine what will be the best thing to help reduce those. So we're working with particular adjusted we're adjusting the pH of certain solvents and water to try and help reduce staining. So nothing too aggressive or abrasive. We're not using any kinds of bleaches or anything like that. It's really as gentle as possible, but it's a fine science.
Yeah.
And you have to be really careful, especially when it's in close proximity to something that might bleed. So
yeah. And actually just a follow-up question. You had mentioned scouring a new background, and this person would like to know sort of what that means in more detail.
Scouring a new background.
So when we're talking
about for like your if you're doing a needlework and you have like the canvas, the fabric that you're going to be using, just make sure you wash it in hot water. Make sure it's not going to shrink, and make sure you get any starch that might be in it out. Hot water and a detergent of some kind. Sorry, scouring is just basically washing it in soap and as hot water as possible.
And then we had someone thanking you for a comment about washing linen, but just she mentioned that for hand-dyed fabrics, it might not be recommended to wash the linen. So it seems like we have some knowledgeable folks in the chat.
Yeah, that's for like undyed grounds.
Yep. And then Alexandra had commented about how in the 30 years that she's been working with the Textile Conservation Workshop, how many new techniques have come out. And she wonders how you all keep up with new advances in the field of conservation.
We attend a lot of conferences, and we do independent research ourselves. I've attended and actually presented at several conferences. So have my coworkers. There's a lot of advancements that are coming out all the time, and we really try and keep ourselves appraised of them as much as we can. So
And then it seems like the last one, and if anyone else has a question, please get it. Oh, there's another question. So not the last one. So someone asked how you would recommend framing current textile embroideries. So I know you'd mentioned acid-free materials, but is there any other advice for how they might go about framing pieces that are new or current?
you always want to make sure that they're on a rigid mount, and they're fully supported. So I don't really recommend framing anything on a strainer at this point in time unless there is a solid piece of something behind it. The way we mount things is we always have a fabric covered board that we then stitch the textile to. That's the most supportive way to mount a textile. If it's a modern piece, you can kind of wrap it around a mount and secure it, especially if it's like a needle point that has excess ground fabric around the outside. That's okay. But you want to make sure that you have any wooden frames isolated with you want to make sure that the wood on the inside of the frame is not touching the textile. You can get tape. There's special tapes to isolate the inside of the frames. And you want to make sure that the textile is not touching the glazing. We always use spacers to make sure that there's a gap between the textile and the face of the glazing, because you don't want the two of them pressing against each other. And always use UV filtering glazing.
Yeah, we have many works of art that we need to reframe in our collection because they're, typically just put right up against the glass.
Yeah.
With no consideration for what that could do. So it's a big one. And speaking of sort of some things that folks can do, someone asked if there's a good US source for the conservation materials that you talked about for some of the less risky or safe procedures that they can do themselves, such as micro vacuum attachments, the latex sponges you use, acid-free paper. So sort of any hints you can give for where they might get some of the materials to do this at home.
The micro attachment materials you can get on Amazon. That's actually where we get ours. Acid-free tissue we get from a company called Talas in the city, TALAS. You can also get them. You can also get it from a place called University Products, I believe, sells acid-free tissue. Can't think of the sponge source off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, if there are any more specific questions, there is, I think there's an email address up if people want to follow up maybe with some specific stuff, but that is all the questions that I have seen. So hopefully I caught them all. But I just want to obviously thank you so much, Meredith, for taking the time this evening to do this presentation. As someone who always sees the piece when we hand it over to you and then sees the piece when it comes back, I always love getting a chance to see what goes on behind the scenes. It's fascinating and obviously incredibly important for someone in the museum field to preserve these objects for the future. So we just have a lot of comments coming in. Thanking you for your time. Very fascinating, illuminating. And I want to thank all of our attendees tonight for coming out. This recording will be posted on our YouTube page probably early next week if you want to rewatch it or share it with anyone. And lastly, I want to thank Alexandra, who's here as a guest, for her time today and for helping so much with this exhibit. And just a reminder, our exhibit is open till December 1st. So if you have not seen it and you can make it to Litchfield, we really look forward to welcoming you and showing you this fabulous exhibit. So thank you again, Meredith, and good night to everyone, and thank you for coming out again.